Hello there, my name is Stuart Bailie. I am a music journalist living in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I'm delighted to be part of the U2 conference, marking the 30th anniversary of the album Achtung Baby. I'm in conversation then with Paul Muldoon, major poet, also a lyricist, a gentleman who has worked with the likes of Warren Zevon and the Hanson family, and most recently then collaborating with Paul McCartney on an analysis of 154 of his lyrics, which is something we might touch on later. But the prime reason for us then to have this conversation is to talk about U2 and Achtung Baby. And other people will probably talk about the music and the stylistic achievements of Achtung Baby, but I think it's a moot time really to talk about Bono as a lyricist and what those songs said and what they continue to say, and how they kind of relate to where we were in 1991 and where we might be now. Paul, what we've just said, as a poet, a Pulitzer Prize winning poet and a man who's been involved in lots of things, has Bono and U2 crossed your horizon often?
Oh, he certainly has. I mean, I've been a fan of U2 since the earliest days, really. The first album I got, mind you, was The Unforgettable Fire. It was the first I owned as an objet, and an objet it was, a beautifully produced piece. I had the LP of that. In terms of crossing paths, as it were, in more recent times, I've had the honor, pleasure of getting to know Bono and the rest of the band a little bit. So that's a kind of extra fill-up, as it were. But I started out as a fan. And for example, I was talking to somebody the other day about the time I spent in the University of East Anglia in 1986. And I was playing, I mean, they remember me. In fact, I think they were about to get rid of me because I was playing the Joshua Tree at such a pitch, morning, noon, and night. I mean, it basically, when it stopped, I put it on again because it seemed to be just a remarkable piece of work. And I mean, of course, I'm not the only person who felt that and who continues to feel it. So I was very much a fan in that era, and I remember vividly, of course, the arrival of Achtung Baby. I got it immediately it came out, and again was playing it non-stop. As I remember vividly, in 1991, I was working at Princeton, and I was driving into work often very early in the morning, 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'd be playing it on repeat, as they say. So I come here as a fan.
Okay, and everyone. In 1991, I worked at the New Musical Express. I was the album reviews editor, as far as I remember, at that time. And there was a little bit of, people were getting slightly bored with U2 after Rattle and Hum, which was the sort of the thing that came off the back of the Joshua Tree. And it was a little bit of overkill more than anything. I think the film company kind of put it everywhere, and it was unavoidable, and while there were very strong parts to that record, it just felt like you almost didn't have a choice but to confront it. And I was at the Point Depot gigs, New Year's Eve 1989, and you could feel in the air that there was a change that was moot. That they had mined a certain part of their art, and that something was going on. And Bono did the big speech about we have to go away and dream it out all over again. But you really couldn't have kind of conceived where it was going to go. So it was a surprise, and it took a deal of digestion, really, the kind of, did you get it right away, or did you have to listen hard, or?
You know, I I don't want to sound self-congratulatory here, but I think I did. But first of all, let me just go back there. You know, of course, I know it's the received wisdom that Rattle and Hum was some kind of terrible error of judgment, some kind of dreadful self-regarding mistake. I didn't feel that at all. I loved Rattle and Hum. I went to see it and I remember vividly seeing it in the cinema in New York. I thought it was brilliant. And I've never quite understood the problem with it, honestly. Though I do, mind you, understand how for the band, it might have seemed like the end of something. You know, one thing I would say vis-a-vis that is that one of the things I really admire about U2, then and now, is that they've never stopped trying to reinvent themselves, trying to remake themselves. I suppose this was the first time when it was thrown into such relief. It was such a shift of gear and such a startling noise, basically, with which that album begins, you know. And it's one wonders if one isn't in some kind of industrial setting and with somebody playing drums on a tin can, of course. So it was very different, very educatedly different from the great sonorities that we'd all loved, or at least I'd loved, with what we'd had up to then. And certainly it was a very dramatic way of saying, hey, sorry, folks, listen to this. We're really trying to do something new. I mean, one of the dangers with doing something new for the sake of doing something new is that you run the risk of throwing, as they said, the baby out with the bathwater. But I think actually that didn't happen with this album. And in many ways, well, we don't have to choose, but it may actually be their greatest album. I think some of that certainly was clear at the time. It was clear to me, and I think it was clear to many other reviewers who really, I think, came out pretty much unanimously, as I recall, to say that they thought it was not only a new direction, but a direction that was fruitful. You know, make it new. Ezra Pound said in the poetry business, but there's no point in making it new, as I say, unless it's good. And this was new and good. Though, mind you, it was in conversation. It didn't spring fully formed from someone's brow. You know, they had found a way into that kind of industrial sound, you know, by various artists. It's no accident, for example, that 9 Inch Nails covered that opening song, and you know, it's very much up Trent Reznor's alley also, you know, but it is an alley, or at least it seemed to be an alley. It was an alley that became a boulevard.
Okay, so Scott from the U2 conference not so long ago says, have you got a title for this conversation? And without thinking hard and long about it, I says, well, what about the line "Eclipsed by the Moon"? Because it's a line from The Fly, and it also is a sort of a mood that is part of Achtung Baby. It's about sort of semi-darkness, about sort of a twilight zone. It's about a place where the certainties are put into question. And it's about the nuance of that record, and the nuance, and the you know, I guess the Joshua Tree was that Shaker Quaker, you know, we've gone off to find a new land, and we are our own little tribe, and we know where we're at. And Achtung Baby artfully doesn't quite know where it's at, or pretends not to know where it's at. Does that make sense?
I think it does. Well, I mean, that's one of the great, I suppose, artistic insights into, and one of the great um, factors that lies behind so much art right the way through the 20th century. I mean, the 20th century was a century of fracture. That's if we were looking for one word that would sum it up, that would be it. And we see that represented not only in the visual arts with cubism and, the various the aspects of life being broken down into separate components, which of course was a side effect, as it were, of the rise of photography and the realization that the world could be broken down into these separate frames. So you have nude descending a staircase. You have the wasteland with its heap of broken images. And that those ideas, really continued to obtain right the way through the 20th century and dare we say it, into the 21st. Gone is a sense that people maybe in the 19th century, 18th century might have enjoyed, that God was in his heaven and all was well with the world. I mean, it was now clear after the First World War, for example, the horrors then of the Second World War for sure, and so on and so forth, that this might not be the case. And I suppose that for a band that has, where there is, for many of the members, if not all of them, a strong religious underpinning and a strong belief that maybe that God is in his heaven. That was part of the tension, I think, that is on display here in this album, and perhaps in all of them, and it's a tension that many of us have,
Yeah.
that uncertainty, but there are no certainties. Nothing is sewn up anymore with a bow tied in it,
Yeah.
The world, one of the things we recognize, and it's actually it's a great advance, I think, for us to have recognized that the world is complex. Things are not simple, and we can't expect to understand everything about it. And I mean, one of the glories, I think, in many ways of science, for example, in this era, is that there's now a very profound sense that the more we know, the less we know. And I think it's out of ignorance, out of innocence and ignorance, that great art is made. So that when they went to Berlin to make this album, I think they were putting themselves in a place of vulnerability. And it's out of that, some version of that vulnerability, openness, innocence and ignorance, to use those two words again, that great art is made, out of unknowing. The minute one knows something, one's in trouble.
Yes. It helps if you know your Bible a little bit to pick up some of the references on Achtung, baby. It helps if you know about what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane, what happened at the Last Supper, the temptation of Christ, the fall, Salome. All of these stories and references are all through. You don't necessarily need to know it, and it's not heavy-handed a lot of the time, but they're all there, aren't they?
I believe they are. One of the fascinating things at the moment, now I'm a teacher and I've been a teacher for 35 years. And, one of the fascinating things about working with, and I work in America, and I suppose I work with a particular cross-section. Actually, it's a wide, our student body in Princeton where I work is drawn from a very wide range of people. But I'll tell you one thing about them. One could not be absent. They know much. but one could not be absolutely reliant on the idea that they would know who Adam was. One could not be absolutely certain that they would have a sense who the devil might be, you know? I know that seems like a very strange thing to say, but, and in fact, maybe it's a good thing that they don't know either of those things. But as you say, it would be extremely useful in terms of really getting a little bit further in to having a sense of what might be going on in some of these songs, if one does have a sense of some of the imagery, the iconography of the Old and New Testaments. I mean, I think one of the things about it is that, as with many really interesting works of art, one doesn't necessarily have to know about Salome, right? Though one might have seen a version of her actually, had one gone to see a U2 concert, and maybe was it Zeropa? I can't remember now which Morley appeared in some sense,
Yeah.
as Salome. Okay, so you know, one gets something of that without necessarily getting it all, and one doesn't. You know, with these allusions, one may have a more profound understanding of what is going on, right? But I think really interesting art has an immediacy, right? That's and certainly music has to have an immediacy. It sort of has to grab you by the scruff of the neck. It has to almost bypass your brain and go straight for your solar plexus or whatever, right? Straight to your emotional core, which, by the way, is what the songs on this album do. They're connecting with you on a very rudimentary level, you know?
Okay. The character of the fly, and I think that there's a great relish, especially when Bono started performing. I felt he felt really freed by becoming these people and amplifying parts of his own personality, and you know, the sunglasses came on and he became the trickster, and obviously all the slogans were going on stage behind him, which was a Jenny Holzer type thing, but yeah. To be able to say the unsayable, to be able to almost pivot from your set beliefs as an artist, presumably is a very exciting proposition.
You know, W.B. Yeats, who would be someone I think in whom Bono has quite a lot of interest, actually, among others, and we might touch on later on. You know, has this notion of myself I must remake, and so to remake himself as a pastiche of the rock star, and this was actually the first U2 tour I saw. First time I saw them was with this the tour that supported this album, with George W. Announcing "We will rock you," and of course, I mean, it was an astonishing. I mean, I'd never seen anything quite like it. I may have seen something like it, but not quite like it. I mean, I'd been a big fan of Blade Runner, and of course, there was a Blade Runner aspect to the milieu, the great stacks of video screens that were being presented there, and the general, you know, the mass of electricity that was. One hates to think of the footprint of that, but it was electricity that was always about to. Something was always about to blow in the midst of those stacks of video screens. So it was a very startling a visual experience as well as an oral one. And that was one of the great beauties of that tour. I mean, they're fabulous, as you know, and in the way they see the album and the tour as a continuum. It's one thing. In this case, they tweaked it, so they took the I suppose some version of Elvis Presley, maybe a little bit of Lou Reed thrown in there, with the gold, some version of the gold lame and the platform heels and all the rest of it, and the sunglasses, which actually, I mean, it turns out that we perhaps know a little bit more these days that the glasses were probably actually quite useful to Bono, if there was so much scintillation in the air, given his difficulty sometimes with his eyes, but it was a character with the then, of course, topped off with the little horns, and as you say, everyone loves. The devil has all the good tunes, and so that was something that was happening there too. So it's a very attractive little devil running around there, and attractive on one hand, but raising questions about, well, the role of the rock star and presenting himself, but also the band and maybe the entire project in a somewhat self-deprecatory way, and underscoring the fun of the enterprise. And perhaps, if anything, one of the issues that they were trying to undermine a little bit had to do with the perception of the band as being maybe taking itself a little too seriously, and that might have been actually what some people might have found problematic about Rattle and Hum. As I say, that didn't really bother me at all, but I do see, I know that did bother some others.
Yes. So one of the things that Scott made a kind request when we were doing this is to see if we could find a few kind of Irish literature parallels and some of the things that might have informed Bono. And the Screwtape Letters was C.S. Lewis, Belfast gentleman, who gave us Narnia and other things. And the Screwtape Letters was this idea of a senior devil instructing junior devils in the ways of kind of perverting the virtues of humans. And I think Bono actually, well, the Screwtape Letters featured in a YouTube video where the cartoon character throws down the book in the middle of the video. And I think Bono later explained that it is, you mock the devil and he will flee from you. And again, Oscar Wilde, this idea of give a man a mask and he'll tell you the truth. So this idea of kind of charades or faces or playfulness that goes on, that certainly fed into that.
It certainly did. And to go back to one of my own heroes, and I think one of Bono's, whom I mentioned earlier, was W.B. Yeats. And the mask in Yeats is a really major component in what he does. It was a component in what Ezra Pound, his pal, also did. But and it's interesting actually. I mean, there's something very interesting going on just now, 30 years later, of course, with the fact that we're all wearing masks. And I met somebody yesterday. I didn't, and I know them extremely well, and I did not recognize them at all. I have students whom I recognize only by the tops of their faces. Yeah. And in fact, I left class yesterday with a couple of students, and they took their masks off when they were outside, and I thought to myself, wow, is that what they look like? So, I mean, in a strange, there's something, I mean, we're all very conscious, is what I'm trying to say at the moment, of the impact of this. And what happens when when we cover even part of our face, and it does, I mean, in our day-to-day lives in a minor way, perhaps, raise questions about where the self resides, and is that really who you are? Is that really what you look like? And of course, I mean, the person, the words person and persona, the persona means a mask. And in some sense, the notion of personhood may even contain ideas of being obscured in some way, or not quite showing oneself, you know. So yes, so I think you know, all of that is probably lurking around in the hinterland here, and I mean, they're quite educatedly refer to the screw tape letters, which are absolutely hilarious, of course, as a kind of perverse catechism on how to cause trouble in the world. But yeah, so I mean, again, this is one of the things that's really very important to remember about this band and others, but certainly this band. They're super smart. They're very smart. They're very tuned in. They're very alert to what's going on in a range of art forms, and that all comes together. And I suspect, I don't know if this has ever been attested, but I suspect that one of the reasons why they went to Berlin and went to Hansa, which of course, the studio, which of course didn't turn out to be everything it promised, was, I think, you know, apart from what was happening politically, just a residual sense that Berlin was still a place where the various art forms might be in conversation with each other. And as I said earlier about the you know, set design for the show, for U2 shows, you know, there's always an interest in the look, the sound, the intellectual underpinning. It's all one thing. So that's one of the reasons I think why they went to Berlin, was to acknowledge their own interest in, and the fact that that might have been a place where even then, or maybe even particularly then, there was a real, there was electricity in the air.
Yeah. So just after the album comes out, there's this amazing moment in the Sunday Tribune where Bono reviews the Book of Judas by Brenton Kennelly, and Brendan writes about U2. So it's two major artists really swapping notes, and with this amazing coincidence that they've both been fascinated with the same biblical character at the same time. That's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
It is, and you know, I mean, it indicates a couple of things. What does it indicate? It indicates that, first of all, Ireland is a very small place. I mean, and we do well to remember that. It's one of the great features of Ireland, as our friend, now the several times aforementioned W.B. Yeats proclaimed once. Yeats was very taken by the fact that Ireland, in terms of its size, was a place where, and I think he said one man, he probably meant one person or one persona, or he might have meant one man or a woman, or they. If you have an idea, you can see it through. If you have a plan, you can actually, it's a country in which you could actually get something done. You could make your vision a reality. Right? That's one of the things that fascinated Yeats about it. And, you know, given the size of the country, I mean, if one spits in Ireland, it's news right the way through the country, right? And, you know, everyone reads more or less the same couple of newspapers, a little here and there, maybe a little political coloring one way or the other. And the artistes, in fact, do tend to know one another, right? And, you know, Brendan Kennelly, of course, great poet of recent memory, just passed away there very recently from County Kerry, and who, of course, taught English at Trinity College Dublin for so long, was on the scene. And his daughter, Doodle, also, alas, of recent memory, I think was kind of on the scene with U2 early on. So there was actually a family connection there. I think they knew one another. And Bono has always was always a big fan of Brendan Kennelly, I think. And certainly when it came to the Book of Judas, which this was the book that he was reviewing in the Indo, as they call it, the Sunday Independent, I think there's something about that character, you know, who is somewhat folded into the Mephisto fly character. He's lurking about the devil character there, you know, the person who, you know, was after all one of the apostles, and what happened? He made a significant error of judgment, right? He went down the road of the filthy lucre, and I'm sure, you know, these considerations of art and commerce are kind of folded into that also. But you know, whether or not we needed Judas to have a Christ, I suppose, might be at the center of the interest here, you know. And maybe one does need a Judas to have a Christ, if that's not too perverse. But I think it's part of what the interest was, as I recall.
Yes, and I think Bono picked up on the line, was it to serve the age you must betray it, whatever, you know, which he quoted several times. So but yeah, riveting. I can't pretend to be completely intimate with the Book of Judas. It's a huge piece of work, but the language in it is just, it's like rockets going off all the time. It's incredibly powerful.
Yes. And, you know, I think, again, the point is that Bono, I think rightly, you know, thinks of himself as a poet. What he's doing is part of the same impulse. It's part of the same, there's the same thrust. And as any of the other poets in Ireland, you know, and some of them, you know, donning the mantle of poet in a somewhat more conventional way. But for me and for many others, the term poet it has a very wide brief. And poetry for me and many others is a very broad church, you know. And the business of writing song lyrics is part of the same, it's part of the same activity as writing the more conventional lyric poem. It's all one, it's not exactly the same thing, but it's all part of one process.
Okay. There's several mentions in Achtung Baby to the moon in The Fly, and she moves in mysterious ways. And I think it's almost a theme of the record. It's about being moonstruck. It's about feminine energy. And you know, and it got me thinking a little bit about Robert Graves and the White Goddess, and that idea that there's something has been lost from modern society, that feminine power and strength. And I feel that somewhere in the middle of that record, that's a sub theme. I don't know if you agree with me or not.
Well, I think it is. And, you know, these days, I think we have to be quite mindful of not necessarily falling in so readily with what isn't known as the conventional binary, as it were, of men, women. It's a world which I think is properly, you know, perceived as being slightly more complex than that. As I say, properly, quite rightly. However, I mean, the truth of the matter is that the moon is a major feature in our lives, and the power of the moon is phenomenal. You know, just its physical power is phenomenal. And I think there is, certainly there was for Robert Graves, who was fascinated by you know, various mythologies, including the Celtic mythologies, and who, of course, honored the notion of the goddess. And anyone who has studied this area will know that there's a fantastic book, I think it's by Maria Gamboutis, called the Gods and Goddesses of Ancient Europe. And there was a vast, vast array of goddesses, primarily goddesses, who were worshipped or certainly honored in ancient and old Europe, and various manifestations of moon goddesses, and Diana, for example, are you know, continue to be, I think, somewhat to the fore. I myself am also a huge fan of Robert Graves, another Irishman, though that's somewhat forgotten. His father, Alfred Percival Graves, was counted among the Irish poets. And Robert Graves certainly spent some time in Ireland. He did a very good album with Claddagh Records. And I don't know if Bono ever met him. He might conceivably have met him. But certainly The White Goddess is a book which is, it's the kind of book, if you get into it, you might never get out of it. in terms of his extraordinary range of interests. I'm sure some of it is slightly madcap. And as far as I'm concerned, that's okay. I don't mind madcap. It's all fine. But so I think that probably did feed into the back of the mind of Bono as lyricist here. Yeah.
Yeah, it's about the muse as well, isn't it? And how that all equates with that energy, you know, and
Totally.
I think that's definitely part of it. Yeah.
It definitely is, as it should be. I mean, you know, for what it's worth, I certainly believe in the muse, or what is thought of, what is considered to be, sometimes described as, the muse.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that, and what others mean by it, and I suspect Bono might mean by it, is that there's a sense of something beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
And it might just be the language and the power of language to make its own associations, and the power of language to have its way with us, to use us as vehicles, as channels, as sluices, to find its way into the world. The image I often associate with it and use to try to explain it to people who are perhaps a little skeptical of the notion of the muse, is that in the way that the theory that DNA exists, or that we exist, more accurately, only to be at the service of DNA, right? That's what we're here for, is to promote and perpetuate DNA. And I think at some level, this is what the artiste is doing. They're just a vehicle for something bigger and better than themselves. And better, to go back to this album, again, when you put yourself in the place of just unknowing, innocence, ignorance, when you're humble before the possibility of what might happen to you, which I think they were in the, you know, maybe very educatedly so, nothing wrong with that. You know, they determinedly so, nothing wrong with that. They set out to put themselves in that place. And I think the album actually is testimony to what happens if you put yourself in that place and something really good can happen.
Yes. The song One, it's a very simple song. You know, I think they've been very open that it belongs to the family of you know, so the doo-wop songs and 50 songs that have come, Unchained Melody and songs like that have preceded it. But yet it stands on its own, and it's an incredibly plastic song. It can address, you know, Northern Ireland peace process. It can address AIDS. It can address the reunification of Berlin. You know, is that the mark of a good song, do you think?
You know, I'm very conscious of that idea that the song can mean whatever you want it to mean, and maybe there's something to that, because it certainly has, as you say, it has been conscripted to serve many as a cause, you know. You know, I myself believe that the song's main cause is its own. It's about its own business in the world. And certainly there may be aspects of it that may be channeled in a certain direction. That's very, very understandable. And, you know, that we reach for songs that resonate. And perhaps that's what I'd say about it. It does resonate in a range of ways. Whether or not a mark of great art is that it means whatever you want it to mean, I'm not so sure about that. But to go back to the channeling, one thing we do know about that song is that it represented a real breakthrough for them, because I think they were struggling while they were working on this album. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that the early days, early weeks, early months, perhaps, were quite a struggle. And that one really came out of essentially a jam session, as I understand it. I think I've got that right. And what that means to me is that the improvisational aspect of it, the very nature of a jam, means that you may intellectualize as much as you like what it is to give yourself over to the muse. But in a jam, you definitely have to. You have to go where it wants you to take you. And I think they realized, though, having given themselves over to that, I think the minute they got it down, some version of it down, they realized, I think Edge realized that, you know, this was a keeper. And whether or not a real breakthrough, and whether or not what he recognized was just what you're describing, i.e. that it was that it would, the term I would use, it would resonate in a range of ways, you know. I myself am happy just that it resonates at all.
Yes, okay. We're nearly finished, Paul. We've covered quite a lot in this conversation. I do remember when this record came out and the Berlin Wall was coming down, and people were talking in highfalutin terms about the end of communism and the end of, you know, that the world was, there were no more isms. And in hindsight, it was the neoliberals were coming up, the the dark side, really, and plotting their decade and a couple of decades ahead. So and I think, you know, certainly Achtung Baby and beyond that, Zeropa and Pop Mart kind of charted that change as well. They were wise enough to realize that it wasn't peace, love, and understanding that we were going into. We were going into a more complex world. Does that make sense to you?
Well, certainly with hindsight, I mean, it does. And, you know, I think one of the aspects of history that seems to, I don't know what Bono and you too really would think about this, but certainly one of the things that strikes me is that the idea of history being cyclical is one that I used to believe was the purview of slightly crazy people like William Butler Yeats. I think that's the fourth or maybe fifth time he's been mentioned here.
Was this the Gyres that he was talking about? Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah,
and his general, the sense of history that that the other fella James Joyce had through Vico and others, again, that history was a cyclical business. They were both fascinated by the gyrations or the gyrations, right? And I mean, though I love both of them, at some level I've always thought they were slightly wacko, you know, to be believing that sort of stuff. But now I'm beginning to think if they weren't absolutely right. And I mean, it's hard not to, it's like describing a corkscrew and not doing that. It's hard to talk about it without doing that. But, you know, it does seem that some of these really troubling developments of recent times, you know, have to do with, you know, what we saw in the 20s and the 30s for sure in Europe and beyond, maybe kind of cycling back. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, why I find the idea that the UK has bowed out of Europe to be a particularly troubling one. And by the way, let's not forget, we're very self-congratulatory in Ireland about various things. The fact is, Ireland almost bowed out of Europe too. There was if you remember, there was a vote on which really amounted to whether or not Ireland should leave Europe. And Ireland, though those were not the terms in which the referendum was called, but that was the essence of it. And Ireland sort of decided to leave Europe, and then the government stepped in, if you recall, and this is, if you don't mind my saying, such an Irish thing. The government stepped in and said, okay, guys, you know, that was interesting. That was a very interesting first time round.
Let's do it again.
Let's do it again, right? Let's do that again. And excuse me, and get it right this time, if you don't mind. But anyway, the point is that Europe, many of us remember Franco. We remember the Greek colonels. I mean, we're not even getting back to Mussolini nor Hitler. But I mean, Europe is a real, what would one say, a cauldron. And the fact is that peace in Europe has been sort of maintained for quite a few decades now by some notion of a united Europe, of the EU. And so it's very troubling. And anyway, these various movements do seem to be, you know, what we rejoiced in with the fall of the wall in Berlin. You know, each wall sees another wall. I mean, we look at one being used for the peace process in Belfast, Northern Ireland. You know, those who are interested in walls would do well to remind themselves that there are 21 miles of wall in Belfast right now. You know? Yeah. So is that an advance? I don't think so. Is it coming round again? I fear it might be.
Okay. So finishing off, Paul, you know, you spent, I think, is it 5 years in conversation with Paul McCartney, talking about his canon, his 154 songs. And, you know, you've spent time with Warren Zevon and lots of other people. So you obviously hold music and lyricists, popular lyricists in high regard. And how would you regard Bono then? What was he good at? What's he done well? What does Achtung Baby do well?
Well, you know, I do think his writing is excellent. I think, you know, funny enough, there was a song, or this, you know, I was talking earlier about playing the record on repeat, which I certainly did. It was a CD I had. I mean, I'm one of these people who has a car with a CD player in it, which is almost unheard of. It's an old car, and I don't know what I'm going to do if ever I have to get a new car. So I go out to the car to listen to music, because my CDs are I'm afraid, the mainstay of my collection. But you know, I remember, I guess that one of the song that, as it happens, really stood out for me, among other, you know, very good songs. The one that really stood out for me was "The Fly," and I think the writing there is really, really excellent. And by the way, I would not be inclined to talk about Bono, and indeed this band as a whole, in anything even remotely like the past tense. I mean, they're still doing excellent work, and that, I think, is a measure. We talked about Paul McCartney. One of the things about Paul McCartney is that he's managed to keep going, put very crudely, and to produce, you know, the best of his recent work of a very high standard. And I think Bono's lyrics are, if anything, getting better. And you know, they were ready very much, very good. And I think he's an excellent lyric writer.
Okay. Paul Muldoon, thank you for your time and your thoughts. We have been eclipsed by the moon for the last 45 minutes or so. And we'd like to thank Scott from the U2 conference for setting this up. And my understanding then, this is going to go out around the time of the 30th anniversary of Achtung Baby. And certainly I've enjoyed going back to it in preparation for this conversation, and it really holds up. It's an extraordinary piece of work. So I dare say I'll be listening to it the rest of the week as well, and taking the good out of it. So thank you very much, Paul.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for allowing me and both of us to be part of this conversation, and how wonderful to be able to celebrate this 30 years later.
Yeah, thank you.